class! Good day! Welcome to another lesson on contemporary, popular, and emergent literature. After discussing romance and science fiction, let us move to another literature genre, which is detective stories. Detective story is a type of popular literature in which a crime is introduced and investigated. The traditional elements of detective story are the seemingly perfectly crime, the wrongly accused suspect at whom circumstantial evidence points, the bungling of dim-witted police, the greater powers of observation and superior mind of the detective, and the startling and unexpected denouement in which the detective reveals how the identity of the culprit was ascertained. On this lesson, there are terms that we must know to understand it more. And we will start with the characters in a mystery. Aside from the word detective, there are two terms or words that is its synonym. Can you tell the answer? It both starts with letter S. Correct. It is sleuth and spy. A person who investigates a crime.
Next,
It is a person who sees an event, one that gives evidence or who testifies. It is witness. Last, it is a person who thought to be guilty of a crime or offense. The answer is suspect. Now, let us go back to our lesson proper. What is a detective story? The detective story is a genre of fiction in which a detective, either an amateur or a professional, solves a crime or a series of crimes. With few exceptions, the crime involves one or more murders. Occasionally, detective stories may revolve around spectacular thefts or blackmail, but this is rare. Because detective stories rely on logic, supernatural elements rarely come into play. The detective may be a private investigator, a policeman, an elderly widow, or a young girl, but he or she generally has nothing material to gain from solving the crime. Mystery stories, unlike police procedurals, thrillers, true crime stories, and other crime related genres, are typically focused not on the blood, gore, and horrific details of murder, but instead on the puzzle of an unsolved murder. While contemporary mystery writers may dwell on graphic details, that is still somewhat rare. The first official detective story was The Murders in the Rue Morgue, written in 1841 by Edgar Allan Poe. While Poe was not in the first story to include a mystery or a murder, it was the first to introduce the then new character of the detective. It was also the first story to revolve entirely around the solution of a murder-related puzzle. Poe's writings were short stories, but The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins was a full-length Gothic novel which was at the same time a murder mystery. The most famous of all fictional detectives, Sherlock Holmes, was invented by Arthur Conan Doyle for the Strand magazine in 1887. It was Conan Doyle who developed the idea of the consulting detective who works independently from the police, along with a not quite bright companion whose involvement may provide comedy, drama, suspense, or an opportunity to befuddle the reader with misinterpretations of clues and red herrings. The Golden Age of Mysteries, the 1920s and 1930s, included authors such as Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Josephine Tey, and Gail Marsh. These authors created gentleman detectives and evocative settings. Manor houses, cruise ships, and archaeological digs, among others, have continued to fascinate readers. So, what characterizes a detective? Early detective protagonists were usually professional private detectives. In latter stories, detectives came in all shapes and sizes. witnessed a crime, ordinary people, insurance investigators, etc. Most detectives incorporate the following traits. Can be compared to mythological heroes like Odysseus because they face challenges, temptations, danger, and usually have loyalty to a higher power and usually truth, known as private eyes, which refers to their ability to be all seeing. Usually well educated and sophisticated, sometimes wealthy too. Have physical strength and prowess, tend to have a quick wit and or sarcasm, and have superior abilities to the average citizen in things like card playing, shooting, car racing, etc. Often defeat their opponents with language rather than simple brute strength. Usually ask to restore something, an object, a person, or peace of mind. Here is an example that shows the following traits that was observed on the novels of Sam Speed. Talking about the detective's code. All detectives are expected to have a higher moral code to guide his or her behavior. It typically leads him or her to make choices in the name of doing the right thing. Some aspects of this code include closed mouth and anonymous simply means secretive and avoids publicity or fame. Loyalty to partner and profession. Dedication to the client. Economical with the client's money. And cooperates to some degree with the police, but his or her investigation supersedes the law. Dedication to the client comes first. And last is to examine all possibilities to avoid being tricked. Next, the common themes in detective fiction. Some common and revealed themes that are typical in most detective fiction stories are these 5. A search for an apparently valuable but really worthless item. Apparent crime that is revealed to be a repetition of an earlier crime. A wealthy family with a problem or a secret. The cleaning up of a corrupt town or system. And the antagonist who is the double of the detective. These themes usually revealed using a proper format or what we call a plot diagram. It is a tool that is commonly used to divide a story into different sections. It is easier to analyze the content once the plot diagram's components have been identified. A plot diagram also provides a framework for analyzing and comprehending written prose, and that is usually how we define and how themes were revealed. Next is the common detective fiction characters. As we all know, a character is a person or the entity or other being in a narrative. It is also referring to the mental and moral qualities distinctive to an individual. Here, in this part, we have 4 kinds of characters. The first character is the detective. It can be a male or a female, and a person that shows loyalty to the truth and to the client. Second is the femme fatale. It is an irresistibly attractive woman who leads men into danger and also talks about the detective's love interest and could be the cause of the crime, and so the detective must ultimately reject her. Third, harbinger or the client, the person who comes to the detective for help, and it is the individual that lays out all the clues and explains who is involved in the crime or in the case. Fourth is the villain, a specific individualized bad guy, a culpable class or type such as mobsters or anyone who is involved and or devoted to wickedness or crime. Usually it is accurately a malicious person. So, in distinguishing the 4 types of detective fictional character, there is a template for us to follow. The name must be included, or cited or be known as well as the traits that a character has. In this format, the quote or the evidence that the character may have must be provided. As for the example, a 1930 detective novel, The Maltese Falcon by American writer Dashiell Hammett, beginning with the September 1929 issue, a detective was serialized in the magazine Black Mask. The story is told entirely in the external third-person narrative. No characters' thoughts or feelings are described, only what they say and do and how they appear. The novel has been adapted for film several times. If you know the novel The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett, here are the distinguished characters that follows the format. In this novel, Sam Spade is the detective, Bridget O'Shaughnessy or Miss Wonderly as the client, and she is also considered as the femme fatale type of character, and Caspar Gutman, the villain. In the detective fiction genre, it can be divided into two classes: the formal or the British class, and the hard-boiled or the American class. Hard-boiled detective fiction is more appealing to Americans because it combines realism with humor. Hard-boiled detective fiction is characterized by unsentimental, gritty stories about violence, corruption, and sex. They are graphic and unapologetic. The hard-boiled detective story usually take place in the city, and the detective finds himself at odds with society. And as for the story, I think as an American novelist, the writer of The Maltese Falcon, Dashiell Hammett, uses the genre of American class or the hard-boiled. Moving on to the characteristics of a detective story. C. Hugh Holman's A Handbook to Literature defines a detective story as a novel or short story in which a crime, usually a murder, for the identity of the perpetrator is unknown, that is solved by a detective through a logical assembling and interpretation of palpable evidence known as clues. The first detective stories were written by Edgar Allan Poe, and Conan Doyle acknowledged their influence on his writing. A good detective story generally follows 6 unwritten rules. For the first rule, the crime must be significant, worthy of the attention it receives. Most stories involve murder, though Conan Doyle tied the majority of his crimes to greed and theft. Second, the detective must be in some way a memorable character. He or she must be very intelligent, of course, unusually clever and observant, but also quirky, possessing perhaps some odd idiosyncrasies that distinguish him or her. Kojak's lollipop, Columbus' crumpled raincoat, James Bond's unruffled cool and high-tech gadgets. If you have observed in his movies, so all of these things make the hero somehow distinct. Third, along with an exceptional detective, there must be an outstanding opponent, a criminal clever enough to be a match for the hero, to make the detective solving the crime to be prolonged or can't be too easy. Fourth, because a large part of the attraction of a detective story is the opportunity for the reader to try to figure out the solution along with the detective, all suspects of the crime must be introduced early in the story. And fifth, all clues the detective discovers must be made available to the reader also. There must be transparency and set of clues that readers must be aware of. Finally, at the end of the story, the solution must seem obvious, logical, and possible. The crime must not have resulted from accident or supernatural intervention, and the detective must be able to explain all aspects of the case in a reasonable way. A fine detective story should meet each one of these standards. Learning how to write a detective story is a helpful process for any fiction author. This crime subgenre distills some of the most fundamental aspects of story. cause and effect are strong. Because every character is a potential suspect, we remember how important it is for every story character to have compelling motivations, public and private lives. In writing a detective story and making it an effective detective novel or short story, here are 7 steps that we must take into consideration. Number 1. Draw inspiration from the great detective authors. Get clues on how to write detective story protagonists from great detective fiction authors' work. Edgar Allan Poe was one of the first great detective fiction writers in the English language. Poe published his story The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841, featuring the detective C. Auguste Dupin. Poe's detective fiction is useful to read because it gives useful insights into the genre. Through Poe's characters' words, we form a better idea of how to create detectives who are a cut above. Besides reading the masters for clues on how to write a detective story, learn the basic ingredients of detective fiction. Number 2, learn effective elements of detective fiction plots. Detective fiction itself, a subgenre of crime and mystery fiction, has subgenres of its own. And here are the subgenres of mystery fiction. In a whodunit or whodunit, the reader shares the detective's work. The reader also attempts to deduce who perpetrated a crime based on clues the author weaves into the story. Second, an inverted detective story where readers might witness the criminal act at the start and also learn the identity of the perpetrator. The rest of the story is then built around the process of the detective uncovering this information. And there are other subgenres too, like police procedurals, show policemen tackling and solving crimes. An example of these is the Dexter book series and TV adaptation. Each of these subgenres may have some of the following common detective fiction elements: red herrings, suspects, clues, or turns of events the author creates suspicion around that turn out to be distractions from the truth. This keep the suspense high and make detective story resolutions more unpredictable. Detective inquiries. The detective protagonist, or duo, or team, makes the rounds, inquiring after leads. Inquiries present the opportunity to create further subplots and complications for the primary investigator or investigators. False suspects. Sometimes the police bring in the wrong suspect. This is similar to a red herring, but false suspects are usually more closely related to the crime. Surprise plot twists. There are major unexpected story turns that take the reader by surprise. These are just some of the core ingredients of effective detective plots. Third, we should master the use of red herrings, because detective work relies on reason and deduction. A story is most believable when you include misleading information. Even the best detectives can follow false lines of reasoning if all the evidence seems to support this track. A good example of expert red herring use is Arthur Conan Doyle's novel, The Final Problem. The detective Sherlock Holmes goes out walking with his sidekick, Dr. Watson. Watson rushes back to their hotel when he receives a message saying a woman urgently needs his medical attention. The message turns out to be a ploy by the villain. He sends this false information to get Holmes alone so that he can attack him. In this case, the red herring is not directly related to the commission of a crime. Like Conan Doyle, create red herrings to create circumstances necessarily for pivotal scenes to take place. In addition to creating a desirable story situation, red herring brings surprise, keeping the reader guessing. The element of surprise keeps the story fresh and interesting. Number 4, give characters interesting motivations. We should give each character in the detective story a good motivation. An example, the mysterious woman who tries to avoid your detective's inquiries may be protecting another suspect. This other suspect isn't the true perpetrator but has an incriminating alibi. Because she's protecting him, she herself becomes a suspect. As you plan what actions each character will take in the course of your story, note down their driving reasons. A credible sense of cause and effect, a sense that each character's actions and words have strong motivations, will keep readers believing in your fictional world. Number 5, develop your understanding of detective skills. As writers, we're story detectives. We have to work out how the pieces of each story fit together. Yet not everyone has the skill set of a criminal detective. Forensic capabilities, for example, and advanced powers of deduction. To become a detective fiction author, you or we should grow our knowledge of real-life detective skills, like on learning how a detective might gather information from. It can be on physical surrounds, questioning what does the strange arrangement of furniture say about a scene and what could have played out there. Or psychological observation. If a person behaves a certain way, what does this say about them? Like avoiding eye contact, which means they're lying. Or can be through noticing circumstantial discrepancies. If a person routinely went to a specific coffee shop every Saturday morning and didn't on the weekend the crime was committed, could this be relevant? Or on forensic data. Class, samples taken from a crime scene tell a story too. To write great detective stories, spend some time reading through detective books about how famous crimes were solved. Learn the fundamentals of forensics and common terminology. Arm yourself with extensive information about how crimes are solved to start thinking like a detective. Number 6, always create curiosity and delay satisfying it. In the best detective stories, novels and movies, writers create curiosity. In David Link's cult detective TV series, entitled Twin Peaks, he develops perpetrator and victim in parallel. As we find out more and more about Laura's killer, Link develops Laura too. And that makes it a double process of revelation, making the characters contribute to the story development actively. The viewer finds out about skeletons hiding in the small town's collective closet, circling closer to uncovering the true story of the central crime. This structure means that there are smaller sources of curiosity that emerge in the process of answering the FBI detective agent Dale Cooper's core questions. The biggest answers are reserved for the second and final season. This structure resolves some tension even as primary plot tensions build in the background. This tactic sustains engrossing suspense. Lastly, number 7, trust the reader's deductive capabilities. Detective fiction authors of the so-called golden age of detective fiction, such as Agatha Christie, created complex puzzles in their novels. For example, is Christie's mystery novel, And Then There Were None, in the year 1939, the mysterious deaths of the book's central characters parallel the deaths of the characters in the nursery rhyme, now known as 10 Little Soldier Boys. Based on the rhyme, 10 little soldier boys went out to dine, one choked his little self, and then there were 9. It is up to the reader to try and work out the significance of the nursery rhyme and how the story might proceed. Again, in writing a detective story, there are 7 steps or keys that will guide us. And as I end this lesson, I want to leave this quote of P.D. James. What the detective story is about is not murder, but the restoration of order. I am once again Jana Denise Domingo, and thank you for listening.